Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our second episode, our part number 2 of Reconquering History, where we study the actual texts, historical, first-person accounts, specifically, right now, of Julius Caesar and his campaign that would later be called the Gallic War, that he himself wrote extensively about. If you're following us on YouTube right now, we stream this on Twitch, twitch.tv/author Valentine. We're doing this on Wednesdays in the evening, starting at 6 p.m. here in Japan. So you can make sure to follow us there. If you're watching this live on Twitch, of course, you can hang out on YouTube. If you can't catch the whole thing, we'll be uploading the episodes usually the following day, so you can keep up with the series. So let's talk about what we covered previously. We talked about the early and somewhat middle life of Gaius Julius Caesar and the years leading up to the Gallic War. We talked about his troubled early years, his childhood on the run from the dictator Sulla, his joining the military in Asia Minor, and the campaigns in the East. We talked about his return to Rome and his appointment and election as Pontifex Maximus, his propraetorship in Spain, the difficulties he had with the Senate on his return, in terms of his election, or rather their interference, in his candidacy for consul. We read extensively from both Plutarch and Suetonius in regards to these events and their particulars. And finally, we have arrived here. The curtain draws on the Gallic War. Caesar has been appointed governor, or proconsul if you prefer, of 3 provinces. In the east, Illyricum. In the north of Italy, Cisalpine Gaul. And in the west, Transalpine Gaul, or Narbonensis. They both mean the same thing. If you're following on the screen, we have a map moving around so you can see a bit of where we're talking about. And we'll see that the action starts very quickly for our new proconsul. We're going to be reading directly from Julius Caesar's The Gallic War. I am reading the Oxford World's Classics, translation by Carolyn Hammond. So if you have it, feel free to read along. And we'll be stopping where appropriate to add context and to talk about what is happening in this campaign. Caesar spends a great amount of time not just talking about the military aspect of the campaign, but also the people of Gaul, its culture, its inhabitants, and later on even the people of Britain and the tribes of Germany. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. The first page. This is titled The First Book, 58 BC by our calendar. By the Roman calendar, it's AUC, the year 696. So remember, consuls or rather Romans. Their calendar started with the founding of the city. However, it was more common for them to cite the year by the consuls who were in charge for that year. And we have both. So the year is 696. The consuls are Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesonius and Aulus Gabinius. And this first book is titled War Against the Helvetii, Ariovistus, and the Germans. The whole of Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, and the third a people who in their own language are called Celts, but in ours Gauls. They all differ among themselves in respect of language, way of life, and laws. The river Garonne divides the Gauls from the Aquitani, and the Marne and Seine rivers separate them from the Belgae. Of these 3, the Belgae are the bravest, for they are the furthest away from civilization and culture of the province. Merchants very rarely travel to them or import such goods as to make men's courage weak and womanish. They live, moreover, in close proximity to the Germans, who inhabit the land across the Rhine, and they are continually at war with them. For this reason, the Helvetii also exceed the other Gauls in bravery, because they are embroiled in almost daily battles with the Germans, either when they are warding them off from their own frontiers, or when they themselves take the fight into enemy territory. The land which the Gauls are said to occupy begins at the river Rhone, and is bounded by the Garonne, the ocean, and the territory of the Belgae. The part of it inhabited by the Sequani and Helvetii reaches to the Rhine. This land has one frontier to the north. The Belgae come from the most distant regions of Gaul. Their lands extend to the lower part of the Rhine, facing north and east. Aquitania reaches from the Garonne to the Pyrenees, and that part of the ocean nearest Spain. It faces northwest. Among the Helvetii, by far the most aristocratic and the richest man was Orgetorix. During the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Pupius Piso, his desire to become king led him to start a conspiracy among the aristocracy, and he persuaded all the citizens to leave their land in full force. It would be perfectly simple, he said, to win power over the whole of Gaul. So superior were they in courage to all the rest. He persuaded them the more easily, because the Helvetii are hemmed in on all sides by the natural terrain. On one side by the Rhine, which is very broad and deep, and separates the land of the Helvetii from the Germans. On another by the heights of the Jura mountain range, which stands between them and the Sequani. And thirdly, by Lake Lemanus, and by the Rhone, which separates them from our province. As a consequence, their freedom of movement was constrained, and their ability to wage war against their neighbors was also impaired. As they were so fond of waging war, this made the Helvetii very resentful. In comparison with the size of their population, their glorious reputation in war, and their courage, they considered their territory too restricted. It was about 220 miles from north to south, and 165 from east to west. Mindful of these considerations, and at Orgetorix's instigation, the Helvetii decided to get ready everything they thought was needed for a migration. Buy up as many pack animals and wagons as they could. Sow as much seed as possible to ensure a supply of corn on the journey, and to establish peaceful relations with the neighboring states. They considered that 2 years would suffice for these preparations, and passed a law establishing their decision to migrate on the 3rd year. Orgetorix was put in charge of organizing the migration, and of his own accord he undertook an embassy to the Gallic states. Whilst on his travels, he persuaded one of the Sequani, called Casticus, son of Cadamantelotus, who had held the kingship over the Sequani for many years and had been named a friend of the Roman people by the Senate, to seize the kingship of his own state, which his father had previously held. At the same time, he persuaded an Aeduan called Dumnorix to do likewise. Dumnorix's brother, Diviciacus, was at that time chief magistrate of the Aedui and a very popular ruler. Orgetorix also gave Dumnorix his daughter in marriage. He assured Dumnorix and Casticus that they would achieve their objective with ease, especially since he would himself be seizing power among the Helvetii, who were beyond doubt the strongest of all the Gallic peoples. And he promised them that he would use his strength and his army to help them win their kingdoms. They were persuaded by his words, exchanged guarantees, and swore an oath, hoping that once they had become kings through these very 3 powerful and determined peoples, they could seize control of all of Gaul. News of this plot came to the Helvetii through informers. In accordance with custom, they made Orgetorix plead his defense in chains. If found guilty, the law required that he be burned alive. On the day appointed for the trial, Orgetorix summoned to the court a whole gang of dependents from all directions, about 10,000 in numbers. And he assembled likewise all his army, his many retainers and debtors. By their help he escaped trial, while the citizens, angry at his escape, were trying to pursue the case by force of arms, and the magistrates were mustering a crowd of men from the surrounding countryside. Orgetorix died, and not without the suspicion, according to the Helvetii, that it was by his own hand. After his death, the Helvetii nonetheless tried to put their previous decision into action by emigrating from their own land. As soon as they considered that they were ready for the enterprise, they set fire to all their own towns, about 12 in number, and to about 400 villages, as well as all their private buildings. All the corn, except what they were to carry with them, they reduced to ashes. So once the hope of returning home was removed, they would be the more ready to undergo dangers of all kinds. They ordered each man to bring from his home 3 months' supply of corn, ready ground for himself. They persuaded the Rorici, the Talingi, and the Ladovici, who were their neighbors, to adopt the same plan. Once all their towns and villages were burned down too, they set out together. The Helvetii also welcomed the Boii, who had lived across the Rhine and had crossed into the territory of Noricum and besieged the town of Norea, and made an alliance with them. Stepping out of the text for a moment, I want to talk about the idea of great migrations. sometime before Julius Caesar was born, there was another great migration by two tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutonus, and this led to the Cimbrian War. Now, great migrations in ancient times were especially alarming, understandably so. It involved the movement of hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, material, arms, food, and not always peacefully. In the case of the Cimbrian War, the Germans ransacked their way all the way to Spain and even to northern Italy. They befriended some Gallic tribes who joined them. And from this, Rome suffered several defeats and had an understandable anxiety about large-scale movements of people. We'll go ahead and keep reading. There were only two possible routes for the departure from their home. One went through the land of the Sequani, between the Jura mountain range and the Rhone. It was narrow and difficult, so that the wagons could hardly pass in single file, and the high mountains which loomed over it meant that a handful of men could easily block the pass. The other, which went through our province, was far quicker and easier, because the Rhone, which flows between the lands of the Helvetii and those of the Allobroges, who had recently been pacified, can be forded at several points. The furthermost town of the Allobroges, on the border with the Helvetii, is Genava. A bridge connects the town with the Helvetii, who reckoned they could either persuade the Allobroges to allow them a passage through their land, for they did not as yet appear to be reconciled to the Roman people, or force them to do so. Once everything was ready for the migration, the Helvetii fixed a date, by which everyone was to assemble by the bank of the Rhone. The date was 28 March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius. When news came to Caesar that the Helvetii were trying to journey through our province, he hurried his departure from Rome, and by the longest forced marches possible, he made for Transalpine Gaul and reached Genava. He ordered the whole province to supply as many men as possible, for in Transalpine Gaul there was only one legion, and gave orders for the bridge at Genava to be destroyed. When the Helvetii heard of his arrival, they sent out their most aristocratic citizens to him as envoys, headed by Nemeus and Veracletus, to explain their intention of marching without doing harm through the province, for they had no other route. They asked his agreement to their action. Caesar remembered how the consul Lucius Cassius had been killed and his army beaten by the Helvetii and sent under the yoke, and decided to refuse. Nor did he believe that these men, hostile as they were, would refrain from doing harm and damage if allowed to march through the province. Even so, he told the envoys that it would take a while to consider, and that they should, if they so wished, return on 13 April. Thus, a space of time would elapse in which the soldiers he had ordered could muster. A quick sidebar on the text. Caesar refers to himself in the third person throughout the course of the Gallic War and in the Civil War as well. I imagine that these reports would have been read out loud, and that makes sense to me if he's referring to himself in the third person for other people to read it. So if you hear the words Caesar, it is not someone else writing about Caesar, it is Caesar writing about himself. So what has happened here? The Helvetii, along with some allied tribes, have decided they will migrate west. And their shortest path takes them through Roman territory, through Narbonensis, or Transalpine Gaul, the territory of the Allobroges. If you're looking at the screen, you can see it in the bottom right, actually right now, the Allobroges there, which is bordering the Helvetii. And Caesar, understandably, rejects this notion that they will pass through peacefully and cause no harm to the province and go somewhere else and be on their way. So he rebuffs their request. He doesn't do it immediately. Why? Because importantly, right now he has only one legion, and he's having to assemble as many men as he can from the surrounding areas. So he tells the Helvetii essentially that he'll think about it. Come back in a couple weeks. In the meanwhile, Caesar's getting ready. If I were in his position, I think I would have done the same. Let's continue. Meanwhile, he used the legion he had with him and the soldiers who had assembled from the province to construct a 16-foot rampart and a ditch from Lake Lemanus, which flows into the Rhone, to the Jura Mountains, which form the border between the Sequani and the Helvetii, a distance of over 17 miles. When the work was finished, he allocated garrisons and fortified outposts. If the Helvetii tried to cross without permission, he could then restrain them more easily. When the day he had agreed with the envoys came, and they returned to him, he said that in accordance with the practice and precedent of the Roman people, he was unable to grant anyone access through the province, and he made it clear that he would stop them if they tried to use force. Their hopes were crushed. Some of the Helvetii lashed boats together and made a number of rafts. Others tried to break across the fording places of the Rhone where the river was at its shallowest, partly in the daytime, but mostly at night. They abandoned these efforts, forced back by the defense works, the attacks of the soldiers, and by missiles. Only one way remained, through the land of the Sequani. Because it was so narrow, they could not take this route without the Sequani's consent. When the Helvetii themselves failed to win the Sequani's agreement, they sent envoys to Dumnorix the Aeduan, hoping that he could intercede and sway the Sequani. Because of his popularity and open-handed generosity, Dumnorix was extremely powerful among the Sequani. He was also a friend to the Helvetii, for it was from them that he had taken a wife, Orgetorix's daughter. Spurred on by his eagerness to be king, Dumnorix supported revolution. He also wanted, by services rendered, to put as many states as possible under an obligation to him. So he undertook the negotiations and asked the Sequani to let the Helvetii go through their territory, and he arranged for them to exchange hostages. The Sequani pledged themselves not to hinder the Helvetii on their journey, while the Helvetii promised not to do any harm or damage as they were passing through. A sidebar here, the hostages, if you are listening to this the first time, you should not think of this as like terrorist hostages who have a gun to their head. This is an exchange of usually the children of leading citizens They're not kept in a cage or beaten or starved or anything like that. It's just an insurance policy. Let us continue. News came to Caesar that the Helvetii planned to march through the lands of the Sequani and the Aedui into the territory of the Santonis, which is not far from that of the Tolosates, a state actually in the province. If they succeeded, he knew that it would pose a serious threat to the province to have this warlike nation, which was hostile to the Roman people, so close to such important and completely unprotected corn-producing areas. So he put his legate Titus Labienus in charge of the defense works, which he had constructed, and set out by forced marches for Italy, where he enlisted 2 legions and mobilized 3 more, which had been wintering near Aquileia. He then hastened back by the shortest route over the Alps into Transalpine Gaul with these 5 legions. There, the Citronus, the Graiacelli, and the Catarigus had taken up position on some high ground and tried to hinder the army's march. They were beaten in a series of encounters, after which, in 7 days, he marched from Ocellum, the most distant town of Cisalpine Gaul, into the land of the Vacanti in the province. From there he led his army into the land of the Allobroges, and from there to that of the Segusiavi. These are the nearest peoples to the Rhone, outside the province. The Helvetii had already brought their forces through the narrow pass and the land of the Sequani, and had reached the country of the Aedui, which they were pillaging. When the Aedui were unable to protect either themselves or their possessions from the Helvetii, they sent envoys to Caesar to ask for help. They had always behaved well, they said, towards the Roman people, so that they hardly deserved to have their land laid waste, their children enslaved, and their towns stormed almost under the gaze of our army. At the same time, the Aedui Ambari, who were relations and kinsmen of the Aedui, informed Caesar that their land too was being laid waste, and that they were having difficulty in protecting their towns from enemy attack. Likewise, the Allobroges, who had dwellings and property across the Rhone, fled to Caesar, claiming that everything but their land had been taken from them. For these reasons, Caesar decided not to wait until all the property of Rome's allies was destroyed and the Helvetii had reached the territory of the Santonis. There is a river called the Saone, which flows through the lands of the Aedui and Sequani into the Rhone so very slowly that it is impossible to tell just by looking in which direction it is flowing. The Helvetii crossed it by lashing rafts and boats together. When Caesar learned from his scouts that the Helvetii had brought 3/4 of their forces across, and that about 1/4 was left on the near bank of the Saone, during the 3rd watch, he set out from camp with the 3 legions and made for that section of their forces which had not yet crossed. He attacked when they were encumbered with baggage and off guard, and killed a great number. The rest fled and hid in the nearby woods. This section consisted of men known as Tigurini, after their district. The whole state of the Helvetii is divided into 4 such districts. In the time of our fathers, the Tigurini had migrated on their own. They had killed the consul Lucius Cassius and sent his army under the yoke. So whether by chance or by the gods' design, that section of the Helvetian state, which had once inflicted an infamous defeat on the Roman people, was also the first to pay the penalty. In doing so, Caesar avenged not only a national, but also a private injury. For the grandfather of his father-in-law, Lucius Piso, was a legate, also called Lucius Piso, killed by the Tigurini in the same battle as Cassius. After the battle, he had a bridge built over the Saône and led his army across it to pursue the Helvetii. They were thrown into confusion by his unexpected arrival, and when they learned that he had taken only a day to cross the river, a task which had taken them 20 days, and then with extreme difficulty, they sent envoys to him. The embassy was headed by Divico, who had led the Helvetii in the war against Cassius. He spoke with Caesar to this effect: if the Roman people made peace with the Helvetii, they would go to whatever region Caesar decided and stay wherever he wished them to remain. If, however, he continued to pursue them with war, he should remember both the former misfortunes of the Roman people and the ancient bravery of the Helvetii. He had attacked a single section of their people unexpectedly, at a time when those who had crossed the river could not come to their assistance, and so for this reason, he ought not to attribute too much to his own bravery, nor should he treat them with contempt. The Helvetii had learned from their fathers and their forefathers to fight with courage rather than cunning or treachery, and so Caesar should not allow the place where they were holding talks to win fame or future renown because of a disaster for the Roman people and the massacre of an army. Caesar replied to the envoys as follows. Since he remembered those past events which the envoys had mentioned, he was therefore in no doubt, and indeed he was all the more indignant, because that previous defeat had happened through no fault of the Roman people. If its army had at that time been aware of having committed some wrongdoing, it would have been a simple matter to take precautions. But the Roman army had been taken unawares precisely because it did not think it had done anything which gave it cause to be afraid, and so considered it inappropriate to be anxious without good reason. Even if he were willing to forget this old injury, surely it was impossible to dismiss the remembrance of recent outrages, that against his will they had tried to march through the province by force, and that the Aedui, the Ambari, and the Allobroges had all been attacked. As for their haughty boasting about their own victory, and their marveling at that their outrages had gone so long unpunished, these pointed the same way. For the immortal gods usually allow those men they wish to punish for their crimes a time of success and a period of impunity, so that when a change of fortune comes, they are all the more grieved by it. This being so, he would nonetheless still make peace with them if they would surrender hostages to prove to him their willingness to fulfill their promises, and if they would make reparation to the Aedui for the harm done to them and their allies, and likewise to the Allobroges. Divico replied that, from the time of their ancestors, the Helvetii were more accustomed to receive hostages than to surrender them, and that the Roman people could witness this fact. With this reply, he departed. So we'll take a small sidebar from the text for a moment. We can see that there are attempts at talks and reaching a compromise, but they have completely fallen through. The Helvetii did offer that they would go wherever Caesar told them to go, but in Caesar's mind, he wants the Helvetii nowhere else except in the Helvetii's own territory. Having them migrate west towards an area which Rome does not keep heavily defended exposes the frontier to a new front. No pun intended. And that he sees as unacceptable to the stability of the Roman state. Let's go ahead and keep reading. The following day, the Helvetii struck camp and moved out of the area. So did Caesar, who sent all his cavalry ahead, 4,000 in number, recruited from all over the province, and from the Aedui and their allies, to see where the enemy was marching. But they pursued the rearguard too eagerly, and joined battle with the Helveti's cavalry on unfavorable ground. A few of our men were killed. The Helvetii were elated by the engagement, because they had routed such a large force of cavalry with only 500 horse. So they began at times to make a bolder stand, and with their rearguard to provoke our men to fight. Caesar restrained his men from fighting, content for the time being to prevent the enemy from pillaging, foraging, and plundering. In this way they marched for about a fortnight, so that no more than 4 or 5 miles lay between the enemy rearguard and our vanguard. Meanwhile, Caesar was daily demanding from the Aedui the corn which had been promised by their government. For because of the cold, Gaul, as has already been said, lies to the north. Not only was the corn in the fields not yet ripe, but there was not even a sufficient supply of fodder. He was unable to use the corn which he had transported up the Saone by boat, because the Helvetii had changed the direction of their march away from the river, and he did not want to lose contact with them. The Aedui were fobbing him off from one day to the next. Their corn was being collected, they said. It was being transported. It was at hand. This is the ancient Roman version of your check is in the mail. I swear, it's in the mail. You just have to be patient. When he realized that he was being put off too long, and that the time had arrived when the corn ought to be distributed to the men, he summoned the leaders of the Aedui. Many of them were present in camp, including Diviciacus and Liscus, who held the highest magistracy of the Aedui, which they call Vergobret. The Vergobret is annually appointed, and has the power of life and death over the citizens. Caesar reproached them severely for failing to offer assistance at such a pressing time, with the enemy so close at hand, when corn could neither be bought nor taken from the fields. And he complained with particular vehemence of having been abandoned because it was in response to the pleas of a large number of them that he had undertaken this war in the first place. Then at last, Liscus was encouraged by Caesar's speech to reveal what he had previously concealed. There were certain men, he explained, who had particularly strong influence over the people, and who, in the private sphere, had more power than the magistrates. By their treacherous and wicked statements, these men were deterring the people from collecting the corn which they were obliged to provide. It was better, they thought, to submit to Gallic rather than to Roman rule. If at present they could not win supreme control of Gaul, nor did they doubt that the Romans, if they beat the Helvetii, would then snatch liberty from the Aedui, together with the rest of Gaul. Liscus went on to say that they could not prevent these same men from laying our plans and what was going on in the camp here to the enemy. Worse still, said Liscus, he knew that because he had been forced to report this urgent matter to Caesar, he had put himself in great danger, and it was for this reason that he had kept silent as long as possible. Caesar felt that Liscus' words pointed to Dumnorix, Diviciacus's brother. Because, however, he was unwilling to have the matter discussed in public, he quickly dismissed the meeting, but kept Liscus back. When they were alone, he questioned him about what he had said at the meeting. Liscus answered more frankly and confidently. Caesar questioned other men in secret about the same matter. He found that it was true. Dumnorix was the man highly audacious, extremely influential with the people, thanks to his open-handed generosity and ambition for revolution. For several years, he had purchased, at a low price, the collection rights on river tolls and all the Aedui's other taxes, not least because not a single person dared to bid against him. In this way, he had increased his own property and obtained vast resources for the purposes of bribery. He maintained a large cavalry force at his own expense, which he always kept at his side. He had influence even among neighboring states, as well as among the Aedui. To consolidate this powerful position, he had given his mother in marriage to a powerful aristocrat of the Bituriges. He himself had taken a wife from among the Helvetii, and he used his maternal half-sister and other female relations to make marriage alliances with the other states. Because of this connection, he was a strong supporter of the Helvetii, but he also hated Caesar and the Romans on his own account because their coming had weakened his own power, while his brother Diviciacus had been restored to his old place of influence and respect. If something were to happen to the Romans, he entertained the highest hopes of winning the Aeduan kingship through the Helvetii, but the power of the Roman people made him despair not only of becoming king, but even of holding on to what influence he already possessed. As to the unsuccessful cavalry battle, which had taken place a few days previously, Caesar learned from these interrogations that the flight had been started by Dumnorix and his cavalry contingent. For Dumnorix was in command of the cavalry force sent by the Aedui to assist Caesar. The rest of the cavalry had been thrown into a panic by their flight. All this he knew, but then incontrovertible proof was added to his suspicions, that Dumnorix had led the Helvetii through the land of the Sequani, that he had arranged for the exchange of hostages between the two, and that he had done all this not only without the permission of Caesar or the Aedui, but even without the knowledge of either, and that he was being accused by a magistrate of the Aedui. Because of all this, Caesar thought that he had good cause either for punishing Dumnorix himself, or for ordering the Aedui to punish him. One consideration, however, acted as a counter to all these. He was familiar with the devotion of Dumnorix's brother Diviciacus to the Roman people, his great goodwill toward Caesar, his outstanding loyalty, his justice, his moderation. Caesar was afraid of upsetting Diviciacus by punishing Dumnorix. And so, before he attempted to resolve the matter, he gave orders for Diviciacus to be summoned to him. The regular interpreters were sent away, and he spoke with him through Gaius Valerius Priscillus, a leader in the province of Gaul and a close friend of Caesar's, in whom he placed the highest confidence in all matters. At the same time, Caesar reminded Diviciacus what had been said about Dumnorix in his presence at the Gallic assembly, and revealed what each man in turn had told him about Dumnorix. Caesar asked Diviciacus, indeed he urged him, not to be offended, but rather, when the matter was investigated, either to judge Dumnorix himself or to order the state to do so. Diviciacus embraced Caesar in tears and began to plead with him not to judge harshly of his brother. He was aware that it was all true, and no one was more grieved by it than he. There was a time when he himself had considerable influence among the Aedui and the rest of Gaul, while his brother Dumnorix, being so young, had very little, and had risen up by his help. This same brother was now using his strength and power not only to lessen Diviciacus's influence, but almost to destroy him. Even so, he felt the influence of brotherly affection and of public opinion. For if Dumnorix were punished by Caesar while he, Diviciacus, continued to hold a position of favor with him, no one would believe that the punishment was meted out against his wishes, and as a result, the loyal of all Gaul would turn against him. As he pleaded with Caesar at length, he wept. But Caesar took him by the hand, comforted him, and told him to say no more, making it clear that his influence was valuable, and that because of his goodwill and his entreaties, Caesar would overlook both the harm done to the Republic and his own sense of indignation. Then, in Diviciacus's presence, Caesar summoned Dumnorix and explained the grounds for complaint against him, setting out his own view and the state's reasons for protest. He warned Dumnorix to avoid any taint of suspicion in the future, and ended by saying that he was overlooking the past for Diviciacus's sake. Then, to make sure he knew that what Dumnorix was doing, and with whom he spoke, Caesar put him under guard. That same day, Caesar's scouts told him that the enemy was encamped in the foothills just over 7 miles from the Roman camp. He sent men to reconnoiter the hill and find out what sort of ascent there was on the other side of it. They reported back that it was an easy climb. During the third watch, Caesar ordered Titus Labienus, his second in command, to take 2 legions, follow those men who had spied out the way, and climb to the summit. And he explained his plan. Then, during the last watch of the night, Caesar marched against the enemy along the same route that they had taken, sending all the cavalry on ahead. Publius Considius, who was considered a man of wide military skill and experience, and who had served in the armies of Lucius Sulla and later Marcus Crassus, was sent on ahead with the scouts. So let's stop for a moment and talk a little bit about the internal politics of Gaul. What have we learned so far? Well, that's right, Marcus Crassus. Again, to remind everyone watching on YouTube, we are live with this on Twitch, so I also will be responding to questions here and there coming from the chat. But I digress. Let's talk a little bit about the internal systems at work at Gaul. So, even though there are 3, according to the Romans, 3 distinct states in the region of Gaul, that being the Aquitani, the Belgae, and the Gaul itself, or Celtica, however you'd like to say it. They each are home to a various number of tribes, which live in sometimes harmony, but often not. And even within tribes, there seems to be a great struggle for power. In this case, we have the Aedui. And the Aedui is one of Rome's closest allies at this time. They occupy a territory that's relatively close to the Republic. And they also occupy a territory that's very central in Gaul itself. So they have amassed a large amount of wealth by virtue of their position. But as we'll see a little later on, they have also suffered some serious defeats by their neighbors, and have been greatly reduced in prestige and status. Now, Caesar mentions the position of vergobret, and he talks about magistrates. They have a system that's somewhat similar to the Roman consular system, right? There's 2 leaders appointed, and they serve for a year. And these leaders, it seems, aren't always in control, you might say. In this case, Diviciacus, the magistrate, has a younger brother named Dumnorix. Dumnorix has made himself very wealthy by taking control of some of the shipping lanes or trade lanes, getting hold of the taxes. And as an aristocrat, he's forged alliances not only within the Aedui culture themselves, or this Aedui society, I should say, but also with their neighbors, specifically the Helvetii. And he acts outside of the power of the magistrates. He's negotiating deals, he's creating alliances, all under the nose of the people who are supposed to be in charge. Fortunately for him, he has a brother who's willing to vouch for him and try to protect him. But as we'll see, Dumnorix is not exactly grateful for this fact. There's been a few other tribes named. Specifically, the Allobroges were named a few times. They occupy territory within the province now. There was a war between the Republic and the Allobroges, which the Allobroges lost, and they were kind of brought down a peg, I guess you can say. The Vacanti were also mentioned, though more to the south. And the Sequani, who, under Dumnorix's guidance, managed to negotiate a deal to let the Helvetii pass through. But as we will also see, the Sequani have their own problems, and that will come up very, very soon. Let us go ahead and continue reading. That same day, Caesar's scouts told him that the enemy was encamped in the foothills, just over 7 miles from the Roman camp. He sent men to reconnoiter the hill and find out what sort of ascent there was on the other side of it. They reported back that it was an easy climb. I just read this, excuse me. By dawn, Labienus had taken possession of the summit. Caesar was a little more than a mile from the enemy camp. And as he later learned from prisoners, the enemy had not been aware of his own arrival, or that of Labienus's either. But Considius galloped up to him and reported that the summit which Caesar had expected Labienus to be occupying was in enemy hands, and that he had recognized them by their Gallic weapons and emblems. So Caesar led his own men instead to a nearby hill and arranged his forces for battle. He had instructed Labienus not to give battle unless his own troops appeared near the enemy camp, so that the attack upon the enemy would come from all sides at once. And so, once he was in control of the summit, Labienus prepared to wait for our men and avoid engaging. Only late in the day did Caesar at last discover from his scouts that the hill was being held by his own men, and that the Helvetii had moved camp. And that Considius had been so terrified that he had reported seeing what he had not in fact seen at all. The rest of that day Caesar followed the enemy at his usual distance, and pitched his camp about 3 miles from theirs. Next day, as only 2 more days remained before it was time to distribute the army's corn rations, and as he was no more than 16.5 miles from Bibracte, by far the greatest and wealthiest of all the Aeduan towns, he thought it time to make provision for the corn supply. So he shifted his march away from the Helvetii and set out for Bibracte. The enemy learned of this from some runaway slaves belonging to Lucius Aemilius, a squadron leader in charge of Caesar's Gallic cavalry, either because they thought the Romans were fleeing in fear from them, which seemed all the more likely as on the previous day they had not engaged despite seizing a vantage point, or because they were sure that they could cut them off from their corn supply. The Helvetii changed plan, altered their course, and began to pursue and harass our rear guard. When Caesar saw this, he withdrew his forces to the nearest hill, and sent the cavalry to face the enemy assault. Meanwhile, he drew up a triple battle line, consisting of the 4 veteran legions halfway up the hill. On top of the height, he positioned the 2 legions he had recently recruited in nearer Gaul, and all the auxiliaries, and filled the whole hill with men. Meanwhile, he gave orders for the soldiers' packs to be piled together in one place, and for those who were positioned in line higher up to stand guard there. The Helvetii followed with all their wagons, and piled up their baggage in a single place. Then, in a compact line, they repulsed our cavalry, formed a phalanx, and moved towards our front line. Caesar first sent away his own horse out of sight, then did the same with everyone else's, to make the danger equal for everyone and to eliminate any opportunity for flight. Then he encouraged his men to join battle. The soldiers who were posted together higher up threw their javelins and easily shattered the enemy phalanx. Once it was broken, they drew their swords and charged the enemy. The Gauls were severely hindered in the battle by the fact that many of their shields had been pierced and fastened together by the first javelin cast. The iron became bent, and they could not pull it out, nor could they fight properly with the left hand restricted. So after their persistently shaking of their left arm, many of them preferred to throw their shields away and fight unprotected. In the end, they were exhausted by their wounds and began to retreat, moving back to a hill which was less than a mile away. They gained it. Our men were approaching, as the Boii and the Tulingi, who brought up the enemy rear with some 15,000 men, acted as a rearguard. They marched right up to our men, attacked them on their exposed side, and surrounded them. When the Helvetii, who had retreated to the mountains, saw this, they went back on the offensive and began the battle afresh. The Romans wheeled and advanced in two divisions, the first and second lines facing the enemy forces which had already been defeated and driven off, the third resisting the fresh attack. The battle continued long and fierce on both fronts. When the Gauls could no longer sustain our assault, the Helvetii retreated once more into the mountain, and the Boii and Tulingi headed for their baggage and wagons. Throughout the whole battle, moreover, despite the fact that it lasted from the 7th hour until the evening, no one could see an enemy soldier turned in flight. Beside the baggage, the fight continued far into the night, for they had formed a rampart from the wagons, and from this vantage point began to throw missiles at our men as they advanced. Down between the wagons and wheels, some were throwing pikes and javelins, and wounding our men. After a protracted struggle, our men won a possession of the bags and the camp. There the daughter of Orgetorix was taken captive, and one of his sons. About 130,000 of the Helvetii survived this battle, and marched all through that night. They did not break their journey to rest even once, and 3 days later reached the territory of the Lingones. Because of the legionaries' wounds and the need to bury the dead, our men had been delayed for a period of 3 days and had not been able to pursue them. Caesar sent messengers with a letter to the Lingones, warning them not to help the Helvetii by providing food or other necessaries. If anyone did offer assistance, he would treat them as enemies, just like the Helvetii. After the 3-day interval, he began the pursuit with all his forces. And for all intents and purposes, let me take a small sidebar. This is really the first major battle of the Gallic War. The initial conflict that happened when the Helvetii were trying to cross, I believe they said it was the Saone River, over into the Roman province, despite Caesar having rebuffed them. There was skirmishing and some fighting, and some of them did try to force their way into the Roman lands, but there wasn't a great set-piece battle. Now, before this major battle that we just talked about took place, there was another kind of snafu, I guess we could call it, where one of the main scouting parties, who was supposed to confirm Titus Labienus's position, failed to do so. They said that Labienus wasn't there, and in fact it was held by the enemy. And apparently the lead scout didn't recognize his own banners. How embarrassing. So because of this, the Romans lose perhaps the most advantageous position they ever had, and now are forced to engage the Helvetii on different terms. The major battle happens. The fight lasts all day. And despite the rear guard of the Helvetii showing up and seeming to turn the tide for a little bit, the Romans stand firm. Again, the Roman heavy infantry was extremely strong. They could out-persevere any Gallic army. The Gauls were unable to break the Romans, but likewise, the Romans were unable to shatter the Gauls either. Let us continue with our reading. The Helvetii were compelled by their total lack of provisions to send envoys to Caesar to discuss surrender. When they met him, he was on the march. When they met him as he was on the march, they threw themselves at his feet, weeping and humbly begging him for peace. He gave orders that the Helvetii should remain where they were and await his arrival, and they obeyed him. When Caesar arrived, he demanded hostages, weapons, and the slaves who had deserted to the Helvetii. While these were being collected and brought together, night intervened, and about 6,000 men of the village known as Verbigine set out at dusk from the Helveti's camp and made for the Rhine and the land of the Germans. Perhaps they were full of fear at being made to hand over their weapons, or perhaps they were encouraged by the hope of safety, thinking that in such a huge crowd of prisoners, their flight would be concealed or would even escape notice altogether. After confirming his suspicion that this escape was taking place, Caesar ordered the peoples through whose territory they were escaping to track them down and bring them back, if they wished to clear themselves of suspicion. When they returned, he treated them as enemies. As for all the rest, he accepted their surrender after the hostages, weapons, and deserters had been handed over. He ordered the Helvetii, Tulingi, and the Lodovici to return to the lands from which they had came. And because their crops were all ruined and they had no means of sustenance in their homeland, he commanded the Allobroges to provide them with corn, and told the Helvetii to rebuild the towns and villages which they had burned. His particular reason for this order was that he was reluctant for them to leave the place they had abandoned still unoccupied, in case the Germans who lived across the Rhine crossed out of their own land into that of the Helvetii, because of the fertility of the soil, and settled on the borders of the province of Gaul and of the Allobroges. At the Aedui's request, he allowed the Boii, who were famous for their great bravery, to settle in Aeduan territory. The Aedui gave farmland to them, and later admitted them to equal rights and freedom. Tablets were found in the Helveti's camp, written in Greek characters, and were taken to Caesar. They contained a complete record under several headings, the numbers which had set out from their homeland, those capable of bearing arms, and a separate list of the boys, the old men, and the women. The sum total of all these categories came to 263,000 of the Helvetii. Of the Tulingi, there were 36,000. Of the Lodovici, 14,000. Of the Rarici, 23,000, and of the Boii, 32,000. About 92,000 of these were capable of bearing arms. The total number was about 368,000. When a census was taken of those who returned home, in accordance with Caesar's orders, the number came to 110,000. 110,000 out of 368,000.
Monster kill.
We got him. So what actually happened here? Now, some people might find it confusing that Caesar is as generous as he is, in letting the Helvetii simply go back home. Not only does he let them go back home, but he negotiates with the states surrounding the Helvetii to leave them alone. And even to support them through their difficult time. He doesn't just send them back and say, good luck. He wants them to be where they were. They provide an important service, you could say, not only to the rest of Gaul, but to Rome, in the location that they occupy, being a neighbor of the German states. Not only this, but he allows the Aedui to negotiate directly with the Boii, another tribe who, as they mentioned, who joined with the Helvetii from across the Rhine. And the Aedui agree to settle the Boii in Aeduan territory, and even to gain the rights and privileges common to the Aedui citizens. This is a spectacular show of mercy and of clemency, in my opinion. And it also shows that Caesar is much more far-sighted. He could have taken many slaves. He could have taken the whole surviving camp as slaves. He could have been richer than Crassus if he had sold a lot. But instead, he aims for stability first. He lets the Helvetii return. So let's go ahead and keep reading a little bit more here. Let me take a nice sip of my water as I do. At the end of the war with the Helvetii, the leaders of almost all the Gallic states came as envoys to congratulate Caesar. They were aware, they said, that Caesar's aim had been to exact punishment in return for outrages long ago inflicted on the Roman people by the Helvetii. Nonetheless, the envoys went on, the outcome was as much to Gaul's advantage as to the Roman people's. For the Helvetii had left their homes, where they enjoyed great prosperity, with the express intention of making war upon all of Gaul, and snatching dominion. From an abundance of sites the Helvetii had intended to select for their home the area which they adjudged the most conveniently situated and fertile, and to make the other states tributary. The envoys requested Caesar's permission to announce a meeting of all Gaul for a particular date, for there were certain requests they wished to make of him, once they had come to an agreement among themselves. Their request was granted. They fixed the date of the meeting, and swore an oath that none but those men designated by common agreement should divulge the proceedings. Aha! And now we have a secret meeting. The plot in Gaul thickens, and not everything is as it seems. Let's read on. When this meeting was ended, the same leaders of the Gallic states as before returned again to Caesar. They asked permission to discuss with him in secret both their own welfare and the good of all. When he agreed, they all wept and threw themselves at Caesar's feet. They were anxious, they explained, to ensure that their discussion would not become public, as they were to obtain what they wanted. For if it were made public, they foresaw for themselves a terrible punishment. Their spokesperson was the Aeduan Diviciacus, and he explained that within Gaul as a whole there were two factions, one led by the Aedui, the other by the Arverni. For many years, the two had been fighting fiercely for supremacy. Then, he said, it came about that the Arverni and Sequani hired some German mercenaries. Initially, about 15,000 of them crossed the Rhine. But once these wild and savage men had conceived a passionate desire for the lands of the Gauls, their way of life, and their wealth, more of them had crossed the river. There were now about 120,000 Germans in Gaul. Diviciacus went on to say that the Aedui and their dependents had frequently fought with the Germans, but had been defeated, suffering disastrous ruin, and had lost all their aristocracy, their senate, and their entire cavalry. Broken by these disastrous battles, those men who had previously been preeminent in Gaul, by reason of both their own excellence and the hospitality and friendship of the Roman people, were forced to surrender their most aristocratic citizens as hostages to the Sequani, and to bind the state by an oath never to ask for the hostages' return, nor to beg the help of the Roman people, nor to deny their perpetual subjection to the power and dominion of the Sequani. Alone of all the men of the Aeduan state, he, Diviciacus, could not be constrained to swear the oath or surrender his own children as hostages. For this reason, namely his lone refusal to be bound by the oath and the giving of hostages, he had fled the state and come to the Senate of Rome to plead for help. And yet, he continued, a worse fate had befallen the victorious Sequani than the defeated Aedui. For Ariovistus, the king of the Germans, had settled in their territory and seized 1/3 of their land, which was the best in the whole of Gaul. And he was now ordering the Sequani to vacate another third, because 24,000 men of the Herudes had joined him a few months before, and he was making a place ready for them to settle in. In a few years they would all be driven out of Gaul, and in turn all the Germans would cross the Rhine. After all, there was no comparison between Gallic land and German, nor was there any contest between the two ways of life. Meanwhile, Ariovistus, as soon as he had engaged with the Gallic forces and defeated them, a battle which took place at Admagedobriga, began to issue arrogant and cruel commands. He demanded the children of all the highest-ranking citizens as hostages, and then inflicted all kinds of torture on them as a warning, should anything be done contrary to his will and pleasure. This Ariovistus was a savage, a reckless hothead. They could endure his dictates no longer. Unless Caesar and the Roman people could help, the whole of Gaul would have to do what the Helvetii had once done: leave their homes and seek out another place to dwell, far away from the Germans, and to risk whatever fortune might befall. If Ariovistus got to hear of this warning, said Diviciacus, he was certain that all hostages in his keeping would be made to pay the ultimate penalty. But Caesar, either through his own and his army's influence, or because of his recent victory, or through the renown of the Roman people, could discourage him from bringing the Germans over the Rhine in even greater numbers, and could defend all Gaul from Ariovistus's outrages. Let's stop and think about this for a moment. Caesar has just won a great battle against the Helvetii tribe. Upon his victory, he receives envoys from many tribes of Gaul, led again by good old Diviciacus, the leader of the Aedui. And things are becoming a little bit more clear. Now, the Gauls aren't particularly mad at Caesar for his, conflict with the Helvetii. They understand why it happened. And they also understand the grievances the Helvetii, or the Romans, had against the Helvetii state. But they had a bigger problem. A German problem. For the Sequani, in their short-sightedness and their greed, had, in a time of weakness and seeking only power, invited the greatest menace in the Western world into their homes. That is the menace of the Germans. And of course, the Germans, who originally only started with 15,000 men to aid the Sequani, start flooding across the Rhine in ever greater numbers. They take the land they had been contracted to protect for themselves. they essentially turned the Sequani into their own state, their puppet. And Ariovistus reigns with an iron fist. And because of this, the Gallic tribes only feel that they can confide in Caesar with absolute secrecy, or in absolute secrecy. They do not want word to get out that they are meeting with Caesar, because, as we said, the Germans took many hostages, which Ariovistus delighted in torturing. And they, if at all possible, would like to see the return of these hostages back to their hands. And so now, for the second time, Caesar finds himself involved in internal Gallic affairs at the requests of the Gauls themselves. Let's go ahead and keep reading. At the end of Diviciacus's speech, all who were present began, amid much weeping, to petition Caesar for help. But Caesar noticed that of all of them only the Sequani did not act in accord with the rest, but stood looking grave, heads bowed, staring at the ground. Wondering why this was so, he asked them, but they did not reply, and maintained the same grave silence. When he repeatedly questioned them, and yet could not elicit a response, Diviciacus the Aeduan answered him, and explained that the Sequani had been more unhappy and unfortunate than everyone else, for they alone did not even dare to complain in secret or to beg for help. Even in his absence, they were afraid of Ariovistus's cruelty, as if he were actually present. Everyone else, at least, had some chance of escape, but the Sequani had received Ariovistus within their own borders. All their talons were in his power, and they must endure whatever torments he inflicted. On receiving this information, Caesar spoke words of encouragement to the Gauls, and promised to take care of the matter. He was confident, he assured them, that Ariovistus would be encouraged to stop his outrageous behavior by Caesar's special favor and influence. He then dismissed the meeting. Many considerations persuaded him to think it his duty to consider this matter and to intervene in it. For one thing, the Aedui, who had more than once been named brothers and kinsmen by the Roman Senate, were now enslaved under the dominion of the Germans, and their hostages were in the keeping of Ariovistus and the Sequani. When he considered the great power of the Roman people, this was a strong reproach to himself and to the Roman state. He could see that for the Germans to become accustomed by degrees to crossing the Rhine and entering Gaul in large numbers posed a threat to the Roman people. Nor did he reckon that such fierce barbarians would hesitate, once they had seized the whole of Gaul, before flooding into the province as the Cimbri and Teutoni had done years before, and then making for Italy. Especially since only the Rhone separated the Sequani from our province. These dangers, he believed, must be countered as swiftly as possible. Indeed, Ariovistus himself had assumed such arrogance, such an air of haughty pride, as was not to be borne. For these reasons, Caesar decided to send envoys to Ariovistus to ask him to select some location midway between the two sides for a parley. He himself wished to discuss state affairs and business of urgent interest to both parties. Ariovistus replied to the embassy, saying that had he needed anything from Caesar, he would have approached Caesar. But if Caesar wanted something from him, Caesar should do the approaching. Moreover, he went on, he did not dare to enter those parts of Gaul under Caesar's control without his army, and he was unable to muster his men in a single place without going to great trouble and effort over supplies. He ended by saying that he found it remarkable that either Caesar or, for that matter, the Roman people, was troubled over Gaul, which he had made his own by right of conquest and war. Ariovistus's words were reported to Caesar, who sent the envoys back to him with the following message. Ariovistus had been treated with great kindness by Caesar and the Roman people when, during Caesar's consulship, he had been pronounced king and a friend of Rome by the Senate. Since, however, he had shown his gratitude to Caesar and the Roman people by being reluctant to attend a parley when invited, and by seeing no reason to discuss or listen to matters of concern to both sides, Caesar was making the following demands of him. First, he should no longer bring large numbers of men over the Rhine into Gaul. Secondly, he must return the hostages he had taken from the Aedui, and grant the Sequani full permission to return to the Aedui the hostages they were holding. He was to do no harm to the Aedui, nor attack their allies. If Ariovistus complied with these instructions, he would have the lasting favor and friendship of Caesar and the Roman people. But the Senate had decided, in the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso, that whoever was in command of the province of Gaul was empowered to act in the state's interest and defend the Aedui and the other friends of the Roman people. So if Caesar did not get what he wanted, he would not ignore wrongs inflicted among the Aedui. Ariovistus replied that the laws of warfare said conquerors could rule those they had conquer in whatever way they chose. Moreover, the Romans themselves were accustomed to ruling the conquered according to their own judgment, rather than another man's orders. If he, Ariovistus, was not telling the Roman people how to handle their own jurisdiction, it was not right that they should hinder him in the exercise of his. After hazarding the fortunes of war, attacking him and being beaten, the Aedui had become his tribute payers. Caesar was doing him a great wrong, for his advance was having a bad effect on these tax revenues. He was not going to give the Aedui their hostages back, but neither would he wrongfully wage war upon them or their allies, if they stuck to the agreement and paid the annual tribute. If they did not, the title of brothers of the Roman people would be of no use to them at all. As for Caesar's declaration that he would be mindful of any wrongs done to the Aedui, no one had ever fought with Ariovistus and had not been destroyed. Caesar could engage when he pleased. Then he would understand what the undefeated Germans could achieve by their courage. Men who, with their extraordinary skill and weapons, had not been beneath a roof in 14 years. At the same time as this speech was reported to Caesar, envoys arrived from the Aedui and the Treveri. The Aedui came to protest about the Harudes, who had only recently been brought across into Gaul and were ravaging their territory. Not even by surrendering hostages, they said, could they win peace from Ariovistus. The Treveri complained that 100 communities of the Suebi had settled on the banks of the Rhine and were trying to cross the river, under the command of two brothers called Nasua and Cimberius. Caesar was much disturbed by these matters, and realized he must act swiftly. Before this new band of Suebi joined up with Ariovistus's veteran forces, making the task of defense more difficult. So he secured the corn supply at great speed, and then headed towards Ariovistus by forced marches. We've had two tribes mentioned here. The first is the Suebi. So I don't think it was mentioned before this, but Ariovistus hails from the German tribe called the Suebi. So the Suebi are the Germans. The Treveri are a tribe north of the current position of the Germans, so north of the Sequani, north of the Helvetii, towards the territory of the Belgae. Perhaps even within the territory of the Belgae now, I'm thinking about it. And they also share a border with the Germans. And the Herodes, which are also Germanic people and friends of Ariovistus, apparently are ransacking their territory as we speak. Clearly, we knew it 2,000 years ago. We knew it 1,000 years ago. We know it today. The Germans cannot be trusted. Let's continue. After 3 days' march, Caesar was informed that Ariovistus was making for Vesantio, the main town of the Sequani, with all his forces to seize control of it, and that he was already 3 days out from his own borders. Caesar knew that he must make every effort to prevent this happening, for the town contained an abundance of the resources necessary for warfare. It was also protected by its natural site in such a way as to provide a strong position for conducting a campaign, especially since the river Doubs practically surrounds the entire town, like a circle drawn with a compass. The remaining perimeter, if not more than 1,600 feet, where the river does not flow, is filled in by a high mountain, the roots of which touch the banks of the river on either side. A wall around its base makes it into a citadel and links it with the town. Caesar made for this place, marching day and night. He seized the town and posted a garrison on it. He remained in Vesantio for a few days to gather corn and supplies, during which time such a terrible panic suddenly seized our whole army, as severely affected everyone's courage and morale. Our men started asking questions, and the Gauls and traders replied by describing how tall and strong the Germans were, how unbelievably brave and skillful with weapons. Often, they claimed, when they had met the Germans in battle, they had been unable to stand even the way they looked, the sternness of their gaze. The panic began among the military tribunes and prefects, and the other men who, having no great military experience, had followed Caesar from Rome to court his friendship. Some of them started offering various excuses for urgent departure, and asked his permission to go. Others stayed behind out of shame, wanting to avoid the taint of cowardice. These men could not conceal their fearful expressions, nor at times could they restrain their tears. They hid themselves away in their tents and bemoaned their fate, or among their friends lamented the common danger. Throughout the camp, all the men were signing and sealing their wills. Thanks to their fearful complaining, gradually, even men of great military experience began to be affected. The legionary soldiers, centurions, and cavalry officers. Some were eager to appear less cowardly, and declared that it was not the enemy they feared, but the restricted, narrow route of the march, the depths of the forest between themselves and Ariovistus, or the arrangement of satisfactory transport for the corn supply. Some even went so far as to tell Caesar that, although he had given the order to strike camp and move out, the soldiers would not obey him, and, because of their fear, would refuse to lift the standards. As soon as Caesar was aware of the situation, he called a council, ordered centurions of all ranks to attend, and severely reprimanded them, primarily for thinking that it was their business to inquire or think about either the direction or the strategy of the march. During his consulship, Caesar went on, Ariovistus had eagerly sought friendly relations with the Roman people. Why would anyone now conclude that he was going to abandon his obligations rashly? In fact, he was convinced that once Ariovistus understood the terms he was offering and considered the fairness of the conditions, he would not spurn the favor either of Caesar or of the Roman people. And even if Ariovistus did start a war, Caesar continued, spurred on by some mad fury, what was there to fear even then? Why did they despair of their own courage or of his anxious concern for their well-being? The danger posed by this enemy had already been experienced in the time of our fathers, when the Cimbri and the Teutoni were expelled by Gaius Marius. On that occasion, it was clear that the army had deserved as much credit as its commander. The same danger had also been experienced more recently during the slave revolt in Italy. In this instance, the slaves were helped to some degree by the experience and training which they had received from us. From all this, said Caesar, they could see how crucial was the firmness of purpose. After all, for a time they had feared the slaves, who were then without weapons. Yet later they had defeated those same slaves after they were armed and had won battles. Finally, the Germans were the same people who had often clashed with the Helvetii, and the Helvetii had frequently beat them, not only within their borders, but also in Germany itself, and yet the Helvetii had proved no match for our army. Perhaps, he went on, some of those present were disturbed by the defeat and flight of the Gauls. But if they took the trouble to inquire, they would discover that the Gauls had been worn down by the long duration of the campaign, before Ariovistus, who had for many months been skulking in his camp in the marshes, giving them no chance to attack him, suddenly launched his assault upon them. When the Gauls had given up hope of battle and had already dispersed, he had won then, more by tactical planning than by conspicuous bravery. And even if there was a place for these tactics when faced with barbarians of no military skill, not even Ariovistus would pin his hopes on the success of such tactics as a means of beating our army. As for those who shifted the blame for their own fear onto a pretended anxiety about corn supplies or the narrowness of the route, they were doing so out of presumption. After all, they apparently either doubted their commander's commitment or they were dictating it to Caesar. Yet his attention was taken up with all these things. The Sequani, the Luci, and the Lingones were supplying corn, and the crop was already ripe in the fields. As for the route of their march, in a short while, they would themselves decide it. On the subject of their declared intention not to follow orders and raise the standards, it did not trouble him at all. He was well aware that whenever an army had disobeyed its commander in the past, it was either because fortune had deserted him, as proven by his failure on the field, or because he had been discovered in some crime and found guilty of rapacity. That he, Caesar, was himself guilty of no crime was evident from the whole course of his life. That he was a man who enjoyed good fortune was evident from his campaign against the Helvetii. And so Caesar concluded he would do at once what he had intended to put off till a later date. The very next night, during the fourth watch, they would strike camp. Then he would know as soon as possible whether their sense of shame and duty was stronger than their fear. Moreover, even if no one at all followed him, then he would still set out, with only the 10th Legion, for he had no doubts about its loyalty. Indeed, it would in future serve as his bodyguard. Caesar had treated this legion with special favor, and had the fullest confidence in its courage. At the end of this speech, the change of attitude was quite remarkable, and there arose an immense enthusiasm and eagerness to start the campaign. The 10th Legion was the first to express its thanks to Caesar, through the military tribunes, for the excellent opinion he had formed of it, and it declared its readiness to start the campaign. Then the other legions urged their military tribunes and senior centurions to make amends to Caesar. They claimed they had never been in doubt nor afraid, nor did they think the supreme command belonged to them instead of their commander. Their apology was accepted. Through Diviciacus, in whom alone Caesar had particular trust, a route was discovered for the march, and by means of a detour of more than 46 miles, it led the army through open country. They set out, as Caesar had said, during the fourth watch. On the 7th day of marching, without a break, his scouts told Caesar that Ariovistus's army was only 22 miles off. Ah. And so we see the old adage, you might say loose lips sink ships, something like that. It's a little bit different. But the Roman army has time to gossip, to talk with the locals who have been beaten down by the Germans severely and who perhaps exaggerate the strength and the power of the Germanic horde. And the fear spreads like a virus. But Caesar tells them, even if you all abandon me, I will still go to fight the Germans. On my own if I have to. This is the duty of the Roman people. And the tribunes and other leaders feel so ashamed of themselves for the things they've said and for their flagrant fears that they make amends, and at once they become quite enthusiastic to march against the Germans. And now they approach Ariovistus. Let us continue. Once Ariovistus learned that Caesar was at hand, he sent envoys to him to say that as far as he was concerned, the parley Caesar had previously demanded could now take place, especially as Caesar had moved nearer, which meant that Ariovistus could now attend without risk. Caesar, who thought that Ariovistus had by now come to his senses, since he was now offering unasked what he had previously refused to do when expressly requested, did not reject this proposal. He was hopeful that in return for the signal services rendered to Ariovistus by both Caesar himself and the Roman people, Ariovistus would abandon his stubbornness once he knew Caesar's terms. The 5th day following this was appointed for the parley. In the interim, when envoys went back and forth between the two sides, Ariovistus made it a condition that Caesar should not bring any infantry to the parley, claiming that he feared being surrounded and trapped. Both sides, Ariovistus went on, should come with cavalry. Otherwise, he would not come at all. Caesar was reluctant to have the parley halted on a pretext, yet did not care to entrust his safety to Gallic cavalry. The most convenient solution, Caesar decided, was to take away the horses of the Gallic cavalry and mount on them instead soldiers of the 10th Legion, in whom he had the fullest confidence. In this way, he would secure a devoted bodyguard, just in case he needed it. There was some wit in doing so, pointed out one soldier of the 10th. Caesar was doing more for them than he had promised, for he had vowed to keep the 10th as his bodyguard, but it was now enrolling them among the equites. For reference here, by this time the Roman legion was not really relying on its own cavalry. Most of the cavalry they used were auxiliary cavalry. They were provided by Roman allies. In this case, the Gauls. The Gauls made up the bulk of the cavalry force in the Roman army. The equites, the joke here being that the equites is the second highest rank of Rome, just below the senatorial rank. So they were an aristocratic rank. They're not quite the creme de la creme, but they're up there. Let us continue. There was a large level area, and on it a mound of earth of considerable size. The place was almost equidistant from the camps of Ariovistus and Caesar. To this place, as mentioned above, they came for the parley. Caesar halted the legion which he had mounted on horseback at a distance of 200 paces from the mound. Ariovistus's cavalry stopped at a similar distance, and he stipulated that they should hold the parley on horseback and bring 10 men with them. When they came out to the place, Caesar began by speaking of the benefits conferred by himself and the Roman Senate, namely that Ariovistus had been declared king and friend by the Senate, and that gifts had been showered upon him. Caesar pointed out that the privilege was one granted to few, and usually bestowed in return for signal services. Although Ariovistus had no right of access to the Senate, nor any just cause for claim, he had received those rewards through the generosity of Caesar and the Senate. Caesar further pointed out that the reasons for friendship existing between the Romans and the Aedui were appropriate and long-standing, and cited the frequency of decrees of the Senate conferring honor upon the Aedui. They had, Caesar said, always held a position of control over all Gaul, even before they sought our friendship. It was the Roman people's custom, Caesar concluded, not only to not deprive the their friends and allies of any property, but also to desire the increase of their favor, prestige, and distinction. Who could allow them to be robbed of what they had brought to the friendship of the Roman people? He then set out the same terms as he had given in his instructions to the envoys, namely to make no war upon the Aedui or their allies, to return the hostages, and if Ariovistus could not send any section of the Germans home, at least to prevent any more from crossing the Rhine. Ariovistus made a curt reply to Caesar's demands, but then spoke long and loudly of his own excellence. He had not crossed the Rhine of his own accord, but at the express request of the Gauls. He had left his home and family in the sure hope of considerable gains. He held a place in Gaul granted by the Gauls themselves, and hostages which they had willingly surrendered, and he was exacting tribute by right of war, such as victors usually impose upon the conquered. He had not made war upon the Gauls, but rather they upon him. Every Gallic people had come to attack him, and he had started operations against him. Every Gallic people had come to attack him and had started operations against him, and their entire force had been routed and overcome by him in a single battle. If they wished to test the strength of Ariovistus again, he was still prepared to fight it out. But if they wished to enjoy peace, it was not right to refuse payment of the tribute which until now they had willingly paid out. The friendship of the Roman people should be a distinction and protection, not a drawback. That was why he had sought it. If, through the Roman people, the tribute were now paid back and the hostages returned, he would reject their friendship as freely as he once sought it. As to the fact that he was bringing hordes of Germans into Gaul, Ariovistus went on, this was for his own protection, not as a means of attacking Gaul. The proof of this was that he would not have come had he not been asked, and that he had not gone on the offensive, but had defended himself. He had entered Gaul before the Roman people did. Never before had the army of the Roman people moved outside the boundaries of the province. What did Caesar want with him? Why was Caesar coming into his territory? This part of Gaul was Ariovistus's province, just as the other part was ours. If he had attacked our lands, it would not be right to give way. Likewise, it would be wrong for us to interfere in Ariovistus's jurisdiction. As for Caesar's statement that the Aedui had been named brothers, he was not such a barbarian nor so ignorant of the affairs as to be unaware that neither in the last war against the Allobroges did the Aedui offer the Romans help, nor did they in turn enjoy the assistance of the Roman peoples in their internal disputes and their contentions with the Sequani. He was bound to suspect that Caesar's friendship was a pretense. After all, he had an army in Gaul, an army to crush him with. Unless Caesar left the area and took his army with him, he would treat him no longer as a friend but as an enemy. In fact, said Ariovistus, if he killed Caesar, he would earn the gratitude of many aristocrats and leaders in Rome. He knew this for a fact from those very men. Through their messengers, and by Caesar's death, he could win the favor and friendship of them all. If, on the other hand, Caesar departed and handed over full control of Gaul to him, he would give him a great reward, and whatever wars he wanted waged, these would be accomplished without any effort or risk on Caesar's part. Caesar explained at some length why he could not abandon the business in hand. Neither his own custom nor the Roman people's allowed him to desert such loyal allies. Nor did he consider that Gaul belonged any more to Ariovistus than to the Roman people. The Arverni and the Ruteni had been defeated by Quintus Fabius Maximus, and then pardoned by the Roman people, but were not turned into a province nor made to pay tribute. If priority of arrival was what counted, then the Roman people's rule over Gaul was fully justified. But if they followed the decision of the Senate, then Gaul, which the Senate had wished to keep its own laws after its defeat, should be free. During the parley, Caesar heard news that Ariovistus's cavalry was coming quite close to the earth mound and riding up to our men, throwing stones and missiles at them. He finished speaking and returned to his men, ordering them not to throw so much as a single missile in return. For although he realized that a battle between his favorite legion and the enemy cavalry would pose no risk, nonetheless he considered a fight inadvisable. Thus, once the enemy was beaten, they could not say that they had trusted Caesar's assurances and been entrapped by him at a parley. When news of the arrogance with which Ariovistus had behaved at the parley spread to the soldiers, how he had ordered the Romans out of the whole of Gaul, how his cavalry had attacked our men, and how this had led to the breaking off of talks, they were filled with even greater eagerness and enthusiasm for the fight. Let's talk a little bit about what has happened. There was a huge back and forth between Ariovistus and Caesar. So Ariovistus claims that he never attacked the Gauls. The Gauls attacked him. Of course, we know that Ariovistus was invited by the Gauls, specifically the Sequani, to help them conquer the Aedui, which they did. It seems that there was a sort of contractual agreement. Say, hey, give us this many men. We'll provide you with money, supplies. They had some sort of arrangement. But when the campaign was finished, Ariovistus chose not to leave. And this is quite important. Ariovistus says that he didn't make war on anyone, they made war on him. And I suppose that's kind of true. He was invited in by the Sequani, after all, that is true. But he had since subjugated several states. And not only that, he was bringing more and more Germans across the Rhine. His excuse that this is for the defense of himself, I believe, is an outright fiction. Now, he claims that he has a right to this land. He's the conqueror, so he can do whatever he wants. But Caesar, of course, as the governor and as the man in command of the neighboring provinces to Gaul, also has an obligation to protect Gallic allies. Caesar mentions in previous conflicts against the Gauls or certain Gallic tribes by Romans, they had not subjugated the Gauls as Ariovistus had since done. And this was because it was more of the wish of the Roman Senate and people that Gaul, aside from those areas already under Roman control, should be left to its own devices. And good relationships with their Gallic allies should be fostered. Now, during this parley, as we see, some of the Germanic cavalry started to engage with the Roman cavalry, and javelins and stones were thrown, and this cut off the negotiations quite abruptly, and Caesar and everyone else were forced to go back to camp. He makes sure to order the men not to engage at any point, because he doesn't want it to look like he betrayed the banner of the parley. And this is important. So let's go ahead and keep reading. 2 days later, Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar. He wished to continue with him the discussion of those matters which they had earlier started but not finished. So would Caesar either decide once more the date for a parley, or if he was reluctant to do so, would he send back an envoy of his own? Caesar saw no reason for talks, the more so since the day before it had proved impossible to prevent the Germans throwing missiles at our men. In his view, to send one of his envoys to Ariovistus would be highly dangerous, as he would be at the mercy of the barbarians. The most convenient solution was to send Gaius Valerius Proculus, the son of Gaius Valerius Cabirus, who had been granted citizenship by Gaius Valerius Flaccus. Proculus was both a brave and cultured young man, and because of his loyalty and his fluency in the Gallic language, which Ariovistus by long custom habitually used, and also because there was no reason for the Germans to do him any harm, he was sent along with Marcus Matthäus, who enjoyed Ariovistus's friendship. Caesar ordered them to discover what Ariovistus was saying and report back. When, however, Ariovistus saw them in his camp, he cried out before his whole army, asking why they had come. Was it to spy? He prevented them from saying anything, and put them in chains. That same day he struck camp, moved out, and took up a position at the foot of a mountain 5.5 miles from Caesar's camp. On the following day he marched his forces past Caesar's camp and encamped 2 miles further on, with the intention of cutting Caesar off from the corn and supplies which were being transported by the Sequani and the Aedui. From that day on, for 5 days without a break, Caesar led out his own forces in front of the camp drawn up in battle formation. Thus, if Ariovistus wanted to engage, he would have his opportunity. During these days, Ariovistus kept his army in camp, but engaged in daily cavalry battle. The kind of fighting in which Germans were practiced was this. There were 6,000 cavalry and the same number of swift and courageous infantry, each of the latter chosen by a cavalryman from the whole force for his protection. In battles they operated together. The cavalry would fall back towards the foot soldiers, who would quickly mass if trouble loomed. If a cavalryman was badly wounded and fell from his horse, the soldiers would surround him, and if it was necessary to advance some distance or retreat swiftly, they had such speed because of their training they could keep pace by holding onto the horses' manes. Caesar realized that Ariovistus was staying in his camp, so to avoid further hindrance to supplies, he selected a spot suitable for a second camp, about 600 paces beyond the place where the Germans were positioned. He marched to this spot in a triple line formation. Then he ordered the first and second lines to stand at the ready, and the third line to construct defenses for the camp. This position was, as was just mentioned, about 600 paces from the enemy. Ariovistus sent towards it a force of about 16,000 troops, together with all the cavalry, to terrify our forces and hinder the work of fortification. Nevertheless, Caesar still ordered the 2 lines to drive the enemy away, as he earlier decided, and told the third to finish the defense work. Once the camp was fortified, he left 2 legions there and a section of the auxiliaries. The 4 remaining legions he led back to the main camp. Next day, he led his forces out of both camps, as usual, advanced a short distance from the main camp, and drew up his battle line, thus giving the enemy an opportunity of joining battle. Once he saw that not even then did they emerge, around noon he took his army back to camp. Then at last, Ariovistus sent out a section of his forces to attack the smaller camp. The fight was fierce on both sides, until night fell, at which point, after many wounds had been inflicted and also endured, Ariovistus withdrew his forces back to camp. When Caesar asked some prisoners why Ariovistus did not engage, he discovered that the reason was a custom of the Germans. Using lots and divination, your older women used to declare whether they could join battle with advantage or not. And they said it was not heaven's will that the Germans should win if they joined battle before the new moon. Next day, Caesar left what seemed an adequate garrison for the camp. Then he placed all his auxiliaries before the smaller camp, in sight of the enemy, to use them for show, as he was rather weak in numbers of legionary soldiers, in comparison with the numbers of the enemy. He himself drew up a triple battle line and advanced right up to the enemy camp. Then, at last, of necessity, the Germans let out their own forces from camp and stationed them at equal intervals according to their communities. The Herudes, the Marcomanni, the Triboces, the Vangiones, the Medes, the Seduci, and the Suebi. They surrounded their battle line with wagons and carts so as to leave no hope for flight. There they placed their women, who, with outstretched arms and weeping, begged the men setting out to battle not to hand them over into Roman slavery. Caesar put 5 legates and a quaestor, each in charge of a legion, to act as witnesses of each man's valor. He started the battle from the right wing as he observed that there the enemy was weakest. At the signal, our men attacked the enemy so fiercely, and the enemy rushed forward so suddenly and swiftly, that there was no room for throwing javelins at the foe. These weapons were cast aside as a sword fight ensued. The Germans, as was their custom, quickly formed a phalanx to sustain our attack. Several of our men were found leaping on to the massed enemy, tearing away their shields with their hands and wounding them from above. Although the enemy line was forced back on the left wing and put to flight, on the right it was pressing on our line by sheer force of numbers. A young man called Publius Crassus, he was in charge of the cavalry, noticed this, and as he was more at liberty to act than those men who were occupied between the lines, he sent the third line in to help our men in difficulty. So the battle swung back in our favor, and all the enemy turned tail and did not stop running until they reached the Rhine, nearly 5 miles away from the field of battle. There a very few trusted their own strength and aimed to swim across, or found boats and thus ensured, thank you for the gifted sub, ensured their own safety. Ariovistus was of their number. He found a small boat moored to the bank and escaped in it. Our men pursued all the rest of the enemy with cavalry and killed them. And so Ariovistus runs away. He doesn't stay and fight. He doesn't die with his men. He runs away.
Humiliation.
Terrible. Ariovistus had 2 wives. One a woman of the Suebi. He had brought her with him from Germany. And the other one from Noricum, the sister of King Voccio, who had sent her to be married to him in Gaul. Both wives perished in the flight. One of his daughters also died, but the other was captured. Gaius Valerius Procillus, bound in triple chains, was being dragged by his guards in the flight when he met with Caesar himself, pursuing the enemy with the cavalry. It brought Caesar as much pleasure as the victory itself to see this most worthy provincial, his own companion and close friend, snatched from the hand of the enemy and restored to him. Nor had Procillus suffered any terrible fate such as would lessen in any degree Caesar's great pleasure and joy. Procillus recounted how, in his presence, lots had been 3 times cast to decide whether he should be burned to death or kept back for a later occasion. But thanks to the lots, he was uninjured. So also Marcus Matthäus was found and taken back to Caesar. News of this battle spread across the Rhine. The Suebi, who had come to the banks of the river, began to move back. And when the people who dwell near the Rhine had realized their panic, they pursued and killed a large number of them. Caesar had conducted 2 major campaigns in a single season, and now, A little later than the time of year required, he led his army back to the land of the Sequani into winter quarters. There he put Labienus in charge. He himself set out for nearer Gaul to hold assizes. And so we have it. The end of the first year of the Gallic War. What has happened here? Well, two major battles were fought for two very different reasons. Both could be argued were in Rome's defense, one more particularly than the others, especially since the Helvetii and their migration had posed a more direct threat to the provinces of Rome. But Caesar has also showed that he is willing to stand with his Gallic allies. We have to remember that the presence of Germany and the influx of Germans across the Rhine was creating a burgeoning issue for all of Gaul. As Diviciacus said, if these Germans continue to cross the Rhine, if their numbers are allowed to swell, then soon all of us will be as the Helvetii once were. It will be us who are forced to burn our homes, to reap our crops, and to set out for fairer lands, because we cannot stand against the might of the German army. And their fear was contagious, but Caesar rallies his men, and in one battle, he forces Ariovistus and all of the Germans back across the Rhine. Stability has been restored. And do we think the Gauls are thankful for this, despite them being the ones who asked Caesar to do this? We'll have to find that out next time. Next week, we'll be reading the second book. And just so you all get a nice sneak preview of it, the second book, I'll read the title here, 57 BC, or by the Roman calendar, 697 AUC. Consuls are Publius Cornelius Lentulus, Spinther, and Quintus Caecilius Metellus, Nepos. And the title is Defeats for the Belgic Peoples. So if you're looking at the map right now, Belgica is in the top right, the northeast of Gaul. The Treveri were mentioned. They're kind of that southeast part of the Belgae. The Remi are in the south, and more towards the north, you can see the Menapi, the Ottawatuki, and the Nervi. And so, once more, Caesar will ride to war. If you've made it this far, everyone, I want to thank you for joining us. Again, if you're listening on YouTube, or watching, I should say, you can like and subscribe to the channel. It's free. You can also join us on Twitch at twitch.tv/authorvalentine. You can hang out with us live. As I said, we do this on Wednesday nights. Well, nighttime for me, anyway. From 6 to 8 p.m. Japan Standard Time. I'd like to thank you all again for the support. And we would like to thank Caesar for fighting hard against the Germanic menace as well. Again, everybody, I hope you have a great rest of your days, evenings, and mornings as they may be. Thank you so much for the continued support, and I'll see you guys next week.